So, Picasso. Picasso was born in 1881, lived through to 1973, so a very long life. A little bit later than Matisse's birth and his death too. We know him mostly for his role in developing Cubism, which he did with Braque, and we'll be talking a lot about that. But I will follow through his whole life. So what I'll actually do is I'll start off looking at his early work, then we'll look at Braque's role with Picasso in developing Cubism, then we'll go back to looking at Picasso's later work. So there's an inner diversity to his art. He produces Cubism, arguably the most radical, innovative movement in early 20th century Western modernism. And then later you'll see in the 1920s him abandoning Cubism and working even in more realistic style. So he's never trapped by one idiom. That's more easy to understand in our more recent era, where we're used to the idea of postmodern artists who one week they're making an abstract painting, the next they're making a pop art painting or whatever it should be, Gerhard Richter, other artists like that. But for an artist of his generation, it's sometimes a little bit harder to understand those things. He's Spanish, I guess we know that, born in Malaga in 1881. His father was also an artist, so he had this early training and early successes and bit of a child prodigy. He spends time in the city of Barcelona, although he's not from Barcelona. Barcelona is an important kind of cultural center within Spain, and with an avant-garde culture of its own. And he's there. He makes a brief trip to Paris at the age of 19. He's returns in the spring of 1901, but then before long he's back in Spain. He's a little bit sort of detached from what's happening in Paris in the very early parts of the century, because he's sort of coming and going like that until he finally commits to live in France. But he's picking up the early works. We see his influences of artists like Degas, Renoir, Toulouse-Lautrec, perhaps particularly. Scenes of Parisian night life and so forth, as Lautrec also produced. Sometimes touches of neo-impressionistic broken brushwork can be seen. Of course, he's also aware of the great Spanish artistic tradition, artists like Velázquez. I'm going to start with a work of 1903 from the so-called blue period of Picasso. The Blind Guitarist, the Old Guitarist, or the Blue Guitar. This blue period, which maybe starts as early as 1901, named, I suppose, obviously from the predominant blue colour of many of the works from this period. It's not entirely blue of course, but blue is the dominant tone. Well, why blue? Well, maybe, some paints are cheaper than others. The blue could be a cheap paint. Different suggestions have been made, some more serious than others. At one point he was sharing a bed. Someone slept in the bed during the day, someone else slept in the bed during the night. It's a way to save money. You're living in a country away from home. You've got to make trying to be an artist, you need to save money if you can. And so he would only be painting at night time because of that arrangement, and therefore can't use natural light and everything. I think it's more that he's never really an artist that interested in colour. Colour is not essential to his art the way it is for Matisse. And maybe it's not so much the blueness of it then as the monochromeness of it, the lack of a diversity of colour. Maybe it's an elimination of colour to concentrate on other aspects. Blue also has the association with melancholy, some suggestion of, maybe reflecting his own mood at the time, or a friend of his had died in 1901 by suicide, fellow artist friend who'd also travelled from Spain to Paris with him. And one of his friends, Sabates, said that in their circle at the time it was felt that sincerity could not be found apart from sorrow. In other words, that it was a sort of fashionable thing, if you want to put it that way, to affect a sort of melancholy mood, and blue helps to create that. And indeed, a lot of the works of this time are imbued by this sort of melancholy feel, and you could almost say it's like a young person's approach to art, to a slightly kind of self-indulgent moodiness that sometimes young people can be prone to. It's a rapprochement with symbolism, really, perhaps, as well. Symbolism is very much concerned with evoking a mood, indirect expression rather than direct description. There's no story being told here. We're lacking the details. We don't know who the hell this guy is. What his life story is. Is he a beggar or something? We don't know. So it's more about evoking a feel, a mood, than anything more definite than that. And that feels more like a sort of symbolist strategy. There's a little bit of social consciousness, sense of, he's blind, maybe he relies on his guitar to make a living, sort of sense of poverty, but it's more about our mood than about his problems, somehow. Blindness emphasizes music, the sound of the guitar, that we are looking at him, but he doesn't see us. The one-way gaze. The elongation of the figure is very distinct, massive. If you imagine him standing up and stretching up, how long his torso would be. Even the fingers are very elongated. Well, that's all very expressive to represent that. Fingers are very important for a guitarist, so that fits the subject quite well. And one can easily find a source for that elongation of form, and that would be the Spanish artist El Greco. But just choose one example almost at random of El Greco's work to show you how that you have that sort of elongation of form in his work. You could say in El Greco's case that that's a sort of mannerist quality. This is broadly you could call El Greco a sort of mannerist artist. Some people would call him that. And in mannerism you do get these elongation, the Parmigianino or whatever have this similar thing. Now El Greco is a very famous, important artist, but at that time he was a lot less well known. So it's not an obvious source to be turning to. Of course, it's a little bit easier if you're a Spanish artist because you're going to be a lot more aware of El Greco, an artist who passed his whole career in Spain, even though, as his name tells us, he was Greek in origin. We think of him as a Spanish artist. But certainly Picasso had a friend in Barcelona who admired El Greco very much, so we know that's one possible link, apart from just the general shared Spanishness. And one visitor to Picasso's studio in 1906-7 points out that there were lots of El Greco prints decorating the studio, so there's some direct evidence of his interest. And anyway, there are some works where the similarity with El Greco particular El Greco paintings, particular Picasso paintings, can be pinned down. Not in this case, but sometimes you can. Well, this is sort of jumping ahead rather. I've only just started talking about Picasso, but I'm already talking about his influence, showing you work by the British pop artist David Hockney. He did a whole series of etchings called The Blue Guitar, which was actually inspired by a poem by the American poet Wallace Stevens, who was inspired by this particular painting, wrote a poem called The Blue Guitar. Actually, although he says in this title piece etching that he was inspired by Wallace Stevens, who was inspired by Picasso, he's also directly inspired by Picasso, and one of the plates in the series shows the old guitarist itself, and little quotations from elsewhere in Picasso's work around the edge. Back to Picasso, The Tragedy. This is 1903. We don't exactly know what the tragedy was. The Blind Guitarist is also 1903. I don't know if I said that. We don't exactly know what the tragedy was. The title tells us there is one, and something sad seems to have happened. The boy is explaining something. Presumably those are his parents. There's a little sort of hint of narrative, but we're not given the full, we just have the one end of the thread and we don't have the whole story. The location is a very abstract one on the edge of the shore. Has someone drowned? They're a fisherman or something. What is it? We don't know. So again, it's more about mood. It's more a symbolist way of approaching things indirectly, to allude rather than to directly describe. The forms are very elongated again. It's almost like a Romanesque sculpture on the facade of a cathedral, or early Gothic sculpture, something like that. There's a sort of sad mood, a mood of resignation. It's not like the boy is explaining something and they're all going to rush off to solve the problem. It's not that kind of mood. It's too big a problem to solve. We just have to kind of accept it, or something like that seems to be the mood. Nothing can be done. A little bit of the influence of an artist we've seen so many other avant-garde artists pick up on, and that is Puvis de Chavannes. This is his work, the Poor Fisherman. So this would be sort of 1881. It has something of the same kind of mood to it. And there's the waterside scene, the fisherman and his family, the same man, woman, young person. but also stylistically, this sense of quiet, isolation, a kind of, again, a lack of the full narrative context that we're given, a sort of muted feel to the whole thing. Color scheme muted as well. So I think that's definitely an influence that's there for Picasso. Life, La Vie, 1903. This is probably one of the more complex of his works from the Blue period. Sometimes he does that. He'll come to the end of a period, but with a sort of summing up work that is more complicated. And here, as much as anywhere else, it's our guess, as much as anyone else's, what it is that the painting is about. Hints of narrative, but they're not spelled out. Whose baby is that baby? Is it their baby? What is it? Or there's a theme of the couple, and then sort of other quotation about the same theme, paintings within a painting that complicate the narrative. Been suggested that it's his response to the death of his friend Casagemas, the artist friend who who committed suicide. The title isn't his title, so we shouldn't read too much into it. He says himself, it wasn't I who gave the painting that title. I certainly didn't intend to paint symbols. I simply painted images that rose in front of my eyes. It's for others to find a hidden meaning in them. So it isn't that there's some clear thing in the artist's mind that he has only indistinctly managed to tell us about in his painting. It's the meaning is in the images, and it's up to us to say, how clear we want to make that. The Frugal Meal. This is an etching, so this is 1904. Well, line, because etching as a medium requires you to focus on line. Line becomes more important here, and blue has gone to be replaced by black, the most common ink to be used with etching. Similar kind of gaunt faces and angularity, elongation of the limbs. We could easily think of works like Degas' Absinthe Drinkers, modern life and the negative side of modern life, isolation, marginality. Maybe this is the art of an outsider. It's worth remembering he's a Spaniard in France. At first, maybe his French is not that great. He's slightly outside the community. He doesn't have a lot of money. He's an artist. That's almost by definition makes you an outsider, an avant-garde artist, especially moving through the fringes of society. So that's the world he's depicting, the beggar with a guitar. Also an artist, of course, a musician. Then works that could be called the Rose period, pink period sometimes people say, or Rose period. Blue is still visible in works at this time. but the palette does change a little bit, and I would say the mood starts to change a little bit. It's still very moody kind of art. His early art is quite emotive, but in a kind of but they're quiet emotions. It's worth remembering that, because once we get to his Cubist phase, there's nothing very kind of emotive and moody about that at all. In fact, it's almost a throwing off of all this, a rejection of the very thing that was, taking up his time and his thoughts, his heart, if you like, in his early phase. So the rose period, well, we can see what colour that name refers to. It's this sort of slightly pinky colour. Maybe it's more of a slightly earthy colour, sometimes a terracotta colour, or a kind of something like that. But the mood is not quite so heavy. One of the themes that comes up at this time is the circus theme. Often they are circus folk. We don't see circus performances, but we do see the theme of the circus people. Of course, they're also outsiders, marginal people traveling from place to place, not part of the settled society. Outsiders. They're also artists, of course, like Picasso. So there's maybe some degree of self-identification there. They have a skill and art. This is the same circus that Degas and Seurat painted, the Circus Medrano, which becomes which had been called the Circus Fernando. The name changes, but it's the same place. Gertrude Stein, the writer, she says, at that time they, meaning Picasso and his circle, all met once a week at the Cirque Medrano, and there they felt very flattered because they could be close with the clowns, the jugglers, the horses and their riders. There's some kind of bonding feeling. So still this theme maybe of alienation or outsiderness suggested. The settings are usually very generalized here. Again, that maybe underlines this sense of not belonging, of unrootedness. The life of the exile or the refugee, this is very much a 20th century theme. And in our own time too, as we know from the news, it's a very big theme too. People displaced, voluntarily or otherwise. He's back in Paris. He went back to Paris late 1904 and met the various poets there, André Salmon, Pierre Revedy, Guillaume Apollinaire, Alfred Jarry. He also met these collectors, Leo and Gertrude Stein, in 1905. Important avant-garde figure herself, Gertrude Stein, and therefore open to the idea of collecting works by Matisse and Picasso. So this is from 1905, the Saltimbanque. That means jugglers or so forth. Balancing. Well, that's what artists do. They have to create balance, compositional balance in a work of art. Clearly there's the distinction between male and female, or strong and slender, back view, front view. This is a larger painting. Again, it's one of these works that maybe sums up a period. This is the Saltimbanque. This is the young acrobat on a ball, both in 1905. It's the same subject basically. That's why I'm mixing the titles up. So something melancholic, but not quite so black as the blue period, not quite as blue as the blue period. Some people have suggested with this work that there are portraits of Picasso and his friends in this work. So this could be Picasso himself, the Harlequin costume, which he sometimes uses in later works to identify himself through. This rather plump figure could be a jester figure, clown figure, could be Guillaume Apollinaire, the poet, who was one of his friends at that time. And then perhaps this could be his girlfriend, Fernand, or something like that. Again, very bare setting. The sense of just huddled together, no belonging to anything. They're not performing, they're moving from place to place, maybe. Just to give you a little bit of history of this sort of theme, I think of Watteau's painting of Gilles, back to the 18th century. Again, the figure's very isolated from the rest of the troupe. Or Daumier in the 19th century. Of course, it's a realist treatment. In that sense, it's very different from Picasso, but it's all part of the background. This is the mountebank playing the drum. So this is he's a traveling performer, or he's got some patent medicine to sell, something like that. But Daumier is showing him very much as an outsider from the settled bourgeoisie of the town, the top-hatted figures in the background. So a similar theme of outsiderness. Or Manet, the old musician, again, a group of outsider figures huddled together in a bare, hardly described landscape. I think there's a little bit of this that has crept into Picasso's work, the influence of Manet perhaps, in a work like this. Good, so I think that's enough for today. So that leaves us at a very useful point to finish. And we'll start again next week with this work, which has something of the colouring of the Rose period, but all that moodiness, melancholy has disappeared already, and it's a turning point to a different direction. This is a portrait of Gertrude Stein, the novelist and collector, who he got to know, and we'll start with that work, which will take us through into Cubism. This is one of the starting points of a movement towards Cubism. So good, let's stop there for today.